Welcome to the second session of the Khushwant Singh Litfest 2021. Vikram Seth, you heard Vikram Seth and reciting his acrostic sonnet, which was first published in 1993 as an introduction to Nandini Mehta's anthology of his writings, Not a Nice Man to Know. Vikram has set the stage for this session, which is a second look at Khushwant Singh's many lives. We have three speakers who will be contributing their own recollections and reminiscences of Khushwant Singh in different capacities. The first is NAINA DAYAL, and she'll be followed by BACHI, KARKARIA, and then PAVAN VARMA. NAINA DAYAL I've known since her childhood. Her parents, late Ravi Dayal and Khushwant Singh's daughter, Mala, were among my most cherished friends. They lived in the flat opposite Khushwant's on the ground floor in Sujat Singh Park. So in a sense, one walked from Khushwant's flat into the second generation with the parents, and then the third generation with NAINA. In addition to protecting Khushwant's legacy, Mala teaches early Indian history at St. Stephen's College at the University of Delhi. Bachi Karkaria is a game changer in India's journalism. She's a popular columnist and a best-selling author. Bachi's many books include a biography of M.S. Oberoi and Mumbai Masti, which, by the way, has nothing to do with Bollywood and cruise ships. Her biography of Captain C.P. Krishnan Nair will be published in February next year. She was the first Indian board member of the Paris-based World Editors Forum, and she's mentioned to me that she will be speaking upon Khushwant Singh as an editor. Pavan Varma will be joining us in a few minutes, and when he does join us, I'll read out his CV. But basically, he's a diplomat who abjured diplomacy to become a successful writer. Let's begin with NAINA. NAINA, you, as his grandchild, have a genetic right to be the first speaker. So, NAINA, when you were 16, you asked your grandfather whether he was a womanizer. Well, now that you know more about your grandfather's life and reputation, if you were 16 again, what would be the first question you'd ask him?
That's actually not a true story.
Well, it's a published one.
It is, but he attributed all manner of things to all sorts of people, and this sounded like a good story to him, but it's actually not a true story.
Okay, good. Tell us.
I've actually written out a piece for this evening, and I'll read that out. Nana would have prepared as well. He would have written out a piece, but he would have mugged it up because he was a very good speaker, and he pretended as though he was making up things as he went along.
Right.
So this is on Nana.
Please.
In the last 20 years of his life, my grandfather Khushwant Singh, Nana, often complained that he was the most underrated member of my family. In my childhood, he was just Nana, who did the odd grandfatherly thing, treating me to Campa Cola on days forbidden in my parents' home, taking me for walks, teaching me swimming. But he was also, to use the sort of expression he would have used, a bit of a pain. During our walks in the Lodi gardens, he would deliver lectures on the Lodis and the architecture of the Bada Gumbad Masjid, and then proceed to quiz me on things he had spoken about. During my summer holidays, he would bang on the door of my room at 7 a.m. and shout, "Jag Jakum Karan," till I hauled myself out of bed. By the time I joined college, I was deeply embarrassed by Nana's public image. His sexist jokes made me cringe. I disagreed with his politics, his support for Sanjay Gandhi and the Israeli state. I wished it had been someone else's grandfather who had proposed L.K. Advani's name as MP from New Delhi in 1989. I wanted to be as different as possible from Nana. By the time I finished college, my grandmother, Nani, was unwell with something I had never heard of till then, Alzheimer's. Nana wrote every day during the years of Nani's prolonged illness, during the time of my father's illness, and indeed almost till the last day of his life, except for the 8 months or so when my mother was in and out of hospital. I learned over time to live in the shadow of disease and death, but it slowed me down. It tired me out. As he published article after article, book after book, Nana berated me for taking too long over my PhD and then not publishing it. While I admired his ability to use his words, get on with important things, whatever the circumstances, I resented the fact that the women in his family, first Nani, then my mother, and then I, became not just the people who ran his home, but adjusted to his schedule in a way that prevented us from having very much of a life of our own. We also became caregivers for very sick people. I felt weighed down by his habits and expectations. But there was so much more to my relationship with Nana than embarrassment, annoyance, and exhaustion. At the age of 14, I started getting up very early, at around 4:30, and would walk across the corridor from my parents' flat to my grandparents' home. Nana made the world's worst tea, but I got used to it, and to studying or reading for a couple of hours, sitting across the room from him. This routine continued for several years, stopped for some years, and resumed a few years before his death. Nana passed on to me a deep interest in the study of religion. From the time I was a little girl, he would get religious objects for me, picked up during his travels: Madonna icons, a scarf from the Dalai Lama, a kada from the Golden Temple, a pendant with the Ayatul Kursi, images of Krishna and Buddha. Over time, he started giving me translations of religious texts. Though he proclaimed himself a confirmed agnostic, his words, he considered working on Sikhism the most fulfilling thing he had done. Again, his words. In his autobiography, he says, "To write on Sikh religion and history was my life's ambition. Having done that, I felt like one living on borrowed time, at peace with myself and the world. It did not bother me if I wrote nothing else," close quotes. A typical day included reading some part of a religious text. He always went over everything with a pen in hand, and his books are not only underlined, but also full of his scribbles in the margins, and often marks of the pan masala that he consumed while reading and writing. It was his interest in religion that led him to think about and write about the power exercised by gurus and godmen. As I was reorganizing some of his books last year, I found a heavily marked copy of the Sanskritist Lee Siegel's Laughing Matters. The chapter with the most scribbles is the one on religious satire, which traces the long tradition of calling out hypocritical men of religion, from the Upanishads to the present. Here is one of Nana's favorite passages, marked with 2 ticks. So this is about Kshemendra, late 10th, 11th century, writing in Kashmir in Sanskrit. And this is Siegel's translation. Kshemendra lists the kinds of men who can be recognized as hypocrites. And this is, as I said, Siegel's translation. A man with a top knot, one with matted hair, one who busily recites prayers in the midst of his family and friends, one who sits in meditation on the roads that lead into town, a man who puts on a show at sacred bathing places, one who worships the gods with many rituals and puts a very big sectarian mark on his forehead. Siegel adds, hypocrisy incarnates as the holy man, the priest, the devotee. I hope we will rediscover the ancient Indian tradition of making fun of religion and religiosity, along with our long tradition of plastic surgery. At a time when it was common for secular Indians to have faith in India's syncretic culture, unity in diversity was the slogan, Nana was willing to confront India's long history of intolerance. He wrote, and again I quote, "One belief is in Hindu-Muslim bhai-bhaiism. We are all children of one God, who is both Ishwar and Allah, Ram and Rahim. Hindus and Muslims and Christians are brothers. The truth is that whenever people of different races, religions, languages, and cultures have coexisted, instead of bhai-bhaiism, there is tension. And if land, property, or business is involved, tension often explodes into violence. The other canard is that there were no communal riots before the British introduced their policy of divide and rule. In fact, Hindu-Muslim tensions have existed since Islam came to India. And before Islam, there were conflicts between Hindus and Jains, Hindus and Buddhists." Close quotes. Nana also connected the dots between 1947, 1984, and 2002. As we declare 14 August, Partition Horrors Remembrance Day, our acknowledgement of the human suffering of 1947 must also acknowledge the suffering of 1984 and 2002, and now also 2013 and 2020. This would mean recognizing, as Nana did, the inherently political nature of violence, the political patronage, the state's disappearance as a guarantor of order, indeed police complicity, the organized operators on the ground, delayed justice in courtrooms. Today, I would also like to emphasize that while Nana and Nani had to build their life afresh after 1947 and rethink what it meant to be Sikhs in India after 1984, Nana evolved a way of keeping faith with decency and goodness, of salvaging humanity and gratitude from his loss. He never tired of telling us that his friend Manzoor Qadir had sent every book, every item of furniture, and even the remaining liquor in their drinks cabinet from their home in Lahore to Delhi. A framed photograph of Askari and Manzoor Qadir still occupies the sideboard of my grandparents' living room, a reminder that the drawing of boundaries need not end friendships. When Nana went to Hadali, his childhood home in Pakistani Punjab in 1987, he wrote about that visit. And I'm quoting from the autobiography. The partition of India in 1947 brought about a complete change in its population. Not a single Sikh or Hindu remained. Our homes were occupied by Muslim refugees from Haryana. A new generation of Hadalians who had never seen a Sikh were then in their 40s. I was uncertain of the reception they would give me. I drove from Lahore and reached Hadali in the afternoon. Village elders awaited me on the roadside with garlands of silver and gold tassels with the words Khush Amadid, welcome, inscribed on them in Urdu. I did not recognize any of the men whose hands I shook. I was escorted to the high school ground where a dais had been put up. Over 2,000 Hadalians sat in rows on chairs and on the ground. Speeches in badly pronounced, florid Urdu were delivered acclaiming me as a son of Hadali. My heart was full of gratitude. As we celebrate Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav this year, I'd like to end with a WhatsApp forward I received from a student during the anti-CAA protests in early 2020. It went like this. A man called Khushwant Singh wrote this long ago. 1970, when Nana wrote the piece for the Illustrated Weekly, is indeed very long ago for my students. Why I am an Indian. So that's the piece. And I'm reading out only a short extract from that. I did not have any choice. I was born one. If the good Lord had consulted me on the subject, I might have chosen a country more affluent, less crowded, less censorious in matters of food and drink, and free of religious bigotry. This is my native land. I don't like it, but I love it. Are you an Indian first, or a Punjabi or Sikh second? Or is it the other way round? I don't like the way these questions are framed. I'm Indian, Punjabi, and Sikh. I want to retain my religious and linguistic identity without making them exclusive in any way. And even so, I have a patriotic kinship with one who says, I'm Indian, Mopla, Muslim, and Malayali. What is this talk about Indianizing people who are already Indian? And has anyone the right to arrogate to himself the right to decide who is and who is not a good Indian? Close quotes. More than 50 years later, we are still asking these questions. As I think about Nana, the tyrant in our home, novelist, short story writer, historian, biographer, translator, amateur naturalist, journalist, columnist, compiler of joke books, old-fashioned patriot, I realized that apart from being just Nana, he was truly the most underrated member of my family.
Lovely. That is so moving. Thank you so much indeed, Naina. Everything that you've said, in fact, resonated with anyone who knew him and knew aspects of him. But what you've done is to reassemble a sort of hologram of a man whom we all dearly miss. He was extremely, extremely humane. And I still remember reading about his work for the POWs, the Pakistani POWs in 1971. And he challenged Mrs. Gandhi at the time and demanded their release as such, because he felt that it was unthinkable, it was unconscionable that they should have been held. But that is a different thing. But Khushwant, as I've said in my prologue, he wrote about everything that agitated him, everything that interested him, and also everything that excited him. And there was no greater excitement that he generated than in the Illustrated Weekly of India when he became the editor. So, BACHI, can I move to you now, since Pavan is not here at the moment? You've been described as a game changer, as I mentioned earlier, but your forte is biography. If you, and I'm going to pose this question before you start speaking, if you were commissioned to write a biography of Khushwant Singh, what title would you give it? What would you put in? And most importantly, what would you leave out?
That's not fair, Aijaz. Actually, I was asked to do a biography of Khushwant ji, but I discovered that everyone with Singh to their name had a piece of writing about him, and there was really nothing left for someone who was called Karkaria. So then I abandoned it. And also because I'll tell you in a second, more serious reason is that you could not write a book on Khushwant Singh without knowing how to read Urdu. And because I think Urdu was very, very close to him. And he also wrote in the Urdu script, whenever
Completely,
he
yeah,
wasn't
yeah.
writing in English. Yes.
Yeah,
So I
yeah, yeah.
thought, and he would quote so many, quotations, shires. So I thought I would certainly not be doing justice to him. All I could write about would be about him as an editor. What
Mhm.
would I call it? I think I can take some credit for the title of his biography, which was Sex, Scotch, and Scholarship. I think
Beautifully.
and he acknowledged it. He acknowledged that that was the title that I suggested when he wrote his own autobiography. What would I leave out? If I claim to be a protege of Khushwant Singh, nothing, because I think that is really what was our takeaway from the Illustrated Weekly, is that you put in everything, you leave out nothing. In fact, you put in all the nasty stuff. And I know that he kind of got this terrible reputation because every time he wrote an obituary, he kind of tore that poor person to shreds, knowing that that person could not answer back. And I think he wrote his own obituary as well, in which he didn't spare himself either. I'm sorry I don't have it at hand, but I think a lot of people are familiar with it. Um, Also, I think that oh, and of course, about things like, leaving out the good parts. Like I mean, this is all the kind of irreverence that got dinned into us on a daily fashion, which is why, one can try to write humor in these very difficult times, and that is that, we were all fresh and new and were getting cover stories in our first year, even as trainees, which was like unheard of in the Times of India. And this was so refreshing about Khushwant Singh that, in the old days, you would have to have ivy covered over you if they ever gave you a byline. And here we were trainees who he gave bylines to. We sat and had coffee with him. And I remember Ghafoor Nurani telling him in all seriousness, "Are you actually asking a sub editor to come and sit in your presence?" And we all did that. And he would sort of, when we would write these cover stories, and we would like to have all the letters which said kudos to so and what a wonderful piece, and he would say, "No, no, no, you can't have that, gali dalo." And we'd say, "It's all right for you, you've got this great reputation, you've had all this acclaim, we're just starting out, can we please have praise written about us?" But now when I look at the letters pages in some of our papers, I cringe, because it's that same standard thaka hua stuff that so and so is so right in saying, and then starts giving us a short précis of what that person has already written. And I think that the letters page is really a kind of a bellwether mark of what a paper is like and what an editor is like. And this is what I'd like to really come down to and say that, there were four mantras really which have guided me. Three are from my father, and the fourth are from Khushwant Singh. And what I learned from Khushwant Singh was that, learn to treat your work very seriously, but don't take yourself so seriously. And this was exactly the opposite of what all our prima donna editors of that time especially did, and what I think has passed down from generation to generation, that a lot of our writers and journalists tend to take themselves far more seriously than they take their own writing. And I know that Khushwant Singh, while he gave us all this encouragement to write cover stories, I mean, if you wrote something, then you just had to deliver, to kind of live up to that reputation. And I think that was also the kind of training that got ingrained in us who started out with him. That at least over the 8 years that I worked with him, I certainly learned to put everything I possibly could into a feature that I wrote, that I learned to walk that extra mile. I learned to ask the next question. And which is why I think that when I afterwards went to the Statesman and got terribly damned because I went as an assistant editor and I absolutely didn't know how to write edits. So then finally, Mr. Shunanda Datta Ray said, "Look, you better not write edits, you're not cut out for it, but please go out and write those feature stories." And therefore, I started writing about the city, which, of course, I mean, was not a subject that I ever wrote in the Illustrated Weekly. But in a way, it was again a carry forward of what I had learned from Khushwant Singh. Because Khushwant Singh really, in the weekly, why was the weekly so popular? Because it really came down to putting in stuff that people were interested in. It wasn't trying to occupy a high ground. It wasn't trying to be intellectual. It wasn't, and Khushwant Singh was one of the greatest intellectuals you could find, but he wore that so very lightly. And I mean, he would say, okay, not Hari Prasad Chaurasia, but Shakila Bano Bhopali. He himself went when Raman Raghav was being tried. He was that murderer, that mass murderer in Mumbai. He went to the court and he wrote these most compelling, pieces. So from that, you learn to be on the scene, to capture every detail, to really work at it, which is why I think I was able to write the kind of feature stories that I did do in the Statesman. And there again, I think made a difference to the city because everybody had given up the city for lost. Calcutta was the dying city, and I know that at one year a person wrote a letter and said, thank you for restoring our faith in our city from an unknown Bengali, and so that was one of the highest praises that I could have got. Again, with Khushwant Singh, I mean, a lot of people who came later kind of were credited with creating the new journalism. But seriously, there wasn't anything that we brought to our papers when we edited that Khushwant Singh hadn't brought in way back in the 1970s. What I told you, three, about talk about things that interest people, leave out cliche, communities. He used to have these cover stories on communities, and he had a very sharp sense of, of circulation, which at that time, people didn't deign to think about, and so he knew that once he kind of wrote about this community, he'd have readers for life from that community. So he was, for all that kind of otherness of his, he was very very sharp in a certain market sense, if you like. And he would walk back from the Illustrated Weekly to his flat in Kolaba and stopping at every bookshop and asking about the sales of his own books and also the sales of the Illustrated Weekly. And of course, along the way, he would be kind of observing life as it was in the raw of
Yep.
of
Bachi,
Dada. Yeah, okay, I'll stop.
I think you'll have to.
Yes, okay.
Very precious memories of him. The last time I saw him was a fortnight before he passed away. I'd taken a copy of my book to him. It was The Resourceful Fakirs. And he said, inscribe it. So I picked up my pen and I was about to. And he said, no, do it in Urdu. And I know Urdu. I said, of course you do. And he said, now write. And then he recited Iqbal and Ghalib, etc. So it was really a very moving moment for me, because it showed that his personality spanned religions, it spanned nationalities, it spanned the world. We're honored that we have Pavan Verma with us. Pavan, I'm sorry we had to start without you, but welcome. And thank you so much for being here at the KSLF. Like Khushwant, you were a diplomat who abjured diplomacy to become a successful writer. You joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1976 and served as India's commissioner in Cyprus and later as your country's ambassador. As an author, you've written on two notorious inveterate romances, Krishna, the Playful Divine, and on Ghalib, the man and the time, and his time. An affection memoir of the Havelis of Old Delhi. On more contemporary themes, the great Indian middle class and being Indian and its sequel, Becoming Indian. For those who prefer armchair sex, you have also written a witty adaptation of Vatsyana's Kama Sutra. Your latest book is The Great Hindu Civilization Achievement, Neglect, Bias, and the Way Forward. Can I invite you, Pavan, to make your presentation and talk about Khushwant Singh?
Thank you. Thank you, Ajaz. Am I audible? Can I be heard?
Clearly.
Yeah, thank you.
Clearly.
So I had the great honor, this is not a cliche, but really a great honor, privilege, both my wife and I, to come to know Khushwant as well as anyone could come to know him. And I was wondering when Nilofer asked me to speak today, if in the 7 minutes that you have given to your panelists, if I could structure my thoughts a little more to convey a sense of what about Khushwant
Of course.
really impacted me when I first met him and in the years after that when I knew him. So I'm going to talk of 6 things about Khushwant. And the first thing, and that of course is very personal, was that he was a great patron to young aspiring authors.
Absolutely.
You know, he had a willing hand of support for nascent creativity. And I recall I was in Delhi on home leave from my posting in New York to our permanent mission to the United Nations. It must have been the winter of 1986 or early 87. And I had written a 300-page manuscript on Ghalib, which you mentioned, Ghalib, the Man, the Times, the biography. And unfortunately, I wasn't getting anyone to publish it. And I got a call from Mr. H.D. Shorey to say, why don't you show it to Khushwant? I said, I don't know him. He said, I'll call him. You call in half an hour. I did. And he said in his usual voice, Kal subah 10:30 baje aa jao milne. So I landed up the next day at Sujat Singh Park, and he was sitting with 2 blankets over him and 2 heaters on a chair reading my manuscript. And I was surprised how he got it, but his son-in-law, Ravi Dayal, Naina's father, had given it to him. And he said to me, Bhai, mujhe tumhari kitab bahut pasand aayi. And then he said to me that I don't know who will publish it, but I'm going to recommend it to Penguin, of which he was the consulting editor, and which Penguin was to open up shop shortly in Delhi. And he did. And the book came out, and it carried for a long time. I think many editions of the book carried his endorsement of the book in a book review where he said an absorbingly readable account of the great poet and his age. So I found him, for a person he did not know, the forthcoming manner in which he came out to assist, provided he found, from his point of view, merit in doing so. It has served as a lifetime lesson for me. Secondly, I think that for all the flippery that is associated often with his writing, I found Khushwant to be a scholar. Anyone who has read his 2 volume on the Sikhs, will understand that he was essentially an academic masquerading as a tongue-in-cheek, insightful journalist. His ability for research, of going to the source of documents, of interpreting them, of collating facts, of making a narrative out of it, with the historian's eye, spoke of scholarship, and that impressed me because I went on to write many more books, but that stayed with me. Thirdly, I really was impressed by the fact that in many ways he was a Renaissance man. If I am an amateur bird watcher today of the feathered variety, may I clarify? Uh, it is because I was so impressed by Khushwant's book on flora and fauna. You know, the book he wrote on Delhi and its moods and changing seasons and trees and flowers, and his great knowledge of birds. And we've sat and had discussions over them many a time. And his ability to take interest in things other than what were his prime occupation, you know, this versatility of temperament, that is something that was a permanent takeaway from him. Not only in personal life, his love for friends, his drinks, his love for sports, and I'll come to that. So, but that Renaissance nature of Khushwant, people don't understand how that what a mesmerizing versatility it was. Uh, the fourth aspect was his intrinsic, inherent discipline. He may give the impression of leading a relatively relaxed and, as he would like best to be known for, a debauched life. But he was a man with a great deal of discipline. He used to wake up, as Nana said, 4:30 in the morning. He had a time to eat his breakfast, his lunch at 12 noon, the times when he used to write, and of course, uh, his great punctuality. I mean, he is to invite you for to his salon, which was the salon of those that mattered, not in terms of the posts they held, but in terms of how different and how good they were in many ways. That was a salon, a few people every evening from 7 to 8. And from South Block in the Foreign Office, I would rush back, pick up my wife, and land up at his house 5 minutes after 7, and sitting on that chair with his feet on the mola in front of him, holding a drink, he would turn to me and said, "Bhai, tum diplomats kahin bhi time se nahi pahunchte ho." So, you know, that 7 o'clock was sacrosanct in many ways.
Yes, indeed.
And there have been innumerable occasions when I have been thrown out of his house at 8 p.m.
We
with
all
a,
have.
we
We
all
all
have,
have.
with a bit of our drink left. So he was a man who lived to a discipline. I still remember that in his earlier part, when he was younger, he would come, for instance, if I would invite him for dinner. Of course, he never drove as far as I could remember. So we used to send the car to pick him up, and he would come. And then if he came with his wife, with Mrs. Singh, he would have two large drinks. If he came without her, three large drinks. And and then he would probably not have dinner at 8:30 or by 9:15. Very often he had dinner with my mother, and then after he left, the party began. But there was this great tension of somehow beginning it at 7 and getting that right company right between coats that he would enjoy, sitting at his feet in the kind of environment he liked, conducive talk. So he was a very disciplined man. And the two last things, if I have the time, I'll finish quickly.
Yeah, in another
Is
minute. Yeah.
another minute was that he
Yeah.
was a real, in the true sense, an iconoclast.
Mhm.
You know, he scoffed at the hypocrites. He said what he believed in. He didn't mind going against the grain. He loved to shock. Very often, he shocked with the courage of conviction. He held to what he believed was true and hated what about tree and hypocrisy. And that iconoclasm, that free thinking, uh, flummoxed people. Nana referred to some of them as support for the emergency, uh, and whatever else, the nomination papers for Mr. Advani. But he did what he thought he should do with very little respect for the consequences in the true tradition of an iconoclastic freethinker. And lastly, even though there was such an age difference between us, he was a good friend and a great human being. You know, I
Indeed.
was going out early in my life as a high commissioner to Cyprus very early in my career. And he called me on the phone. He never used a mobile, on the landline in South Block, to say, "Bhai, मैं तुम्हारे लिए farewell करना चाहता हूँ." His wife was very unwell at that time. And I said, "Sir, it's hardly necessary." And he said, "तुमसे पूछा है?" And then he said, "16 दोस्तों का नाम दे दो." And then I had to think of 16 people who I would have liked to invite. I delayed it slightly. He called again, and I provided him the name of 16 friends. He invited them. He had got kebabs from Wenger's, and normally his bar was unidimensional. He drank scotch and served scotch, but there was a little bit of variety, which he had done all on his own. His wife was very unwell, and he went out to take care, and he was always there. I mean, I have a collection of postcards he has sent to me when I have been abroad. I don't know how they reached me. For him, the postcard was the email of today. He would scribble
Indeed.
2 lines and just send them off, and they would land. So in sum, these are the 6 things about Khushwant that have remained with me forever and which I greatly value, and I say this with a true sense of respect and affection. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Pavan. That was really very moving. I'm now going to pose a couple of questions, and I'd like each of the participants, if they could contribute to it. Khushwant deliberately cultivate this persona that all of you have mentioned of an angry old man as a shield against an intrusive society. And the second question, to allow you time to think, when you meet Khushwant in heaven, as I'm sure he will be, what do you expect his first remark to be to you? So, Naina, would you like to kick off? Was this persona something that he deliberately cultivated?
Sorry, I missed the first question, but I can answer the second one.
Okay.
His question to me would be, why have you still not published your PhD thesis?
Okay, well, give us the answer. Give us the answer. Give us the answer.
There is no answer. I'm not my grandfather turning out book after book. But that would be his question. He asked me that every day. So I missed the first question.
And did Khushwant deliberately cultivate the persona of an angry old man as a shield against intrusive society?
I think he was very anguished by a lot that he saw. And I think his anguish and his anger at what the country had become poured out in his writing. And I didn't read all of it while he was still around, but I almost never read his newspaper articles actually while he was around, and I haven't read most of them even now. This was something I was really struck by when I went back to some of his work, the deep anguish at what India had become. And I used to earlier say that it was good that he died in 2014 because he would not have been able to cope with the changes after that. But I wished he had actually lived till 2020, 2019, 2020. That was a winter of such hope. And the hope came from young women. I wish he had seen that. I wish he had seen young people, young women reciting fairs. I wish, and I knew he would have if he'd been able to, go to all the Shaheen Baghs that popped up all over Delhi, and he would have been really heartened and full of hope. So the anguish was genuine, but he was willing to hope. And there was hope till everything shut down in March.
Indeed,
so
indeed.
That was my answer.
Okay. BACHI, could you answer these questions?
Yeah.
So, did he create this person? Yeah. And what is the question you would expect to ask you?
Actually, Aijaz, yeah, not so much I mean, I can't talk to you about this persona of the angry old man, but I know that I was really upset by that persona that he cultivated of the dirty old man, because he was really not a dirty old man. He was not it at all. And when you look at what we've been seeing about Me Too and all that, I mean, here was this man who was like adored by people. He had the same kind of adulation. He had a lot of young women, all the time, falling at his feet, literally. I mean, you went to his Sujan Singh house, and there'd be the treasured place of which woman would sit at the feet of of that Mora on which his
Well,
feet were
Bachi,
firm.
we won't ask you to name them. We all know who they were.
We all know who they are, right? So, but he was really not at all like that, and I mean, he really was not a dirty old man, but maybe that's the kind of image he wanted to cultivate. He loved to shock, as so many people have
Yeah, of
said.
course. And
About
what do you
your
expect him to say to you? What do you expect him to say to you when you meet in
let me
heaven?
just also tell you this
Yeah,
one a
of
little
course.
further on Naina's, when you asked about the angry old man, I really kind of often wonder that, how would Khushwant Singh have posited himself in today's India? Because so much about it is so absolutely the antithesis of what he believed in. And would he have
Absolutely.
had the strength, to call truth to power? Because at one time during the emergency, he didn't. And I think he genuinely believed in Sanjay Gandhi. I don't think he was doing it to be a chamcha. I don't think he was doing any of that. He genuinely, I mean, everything that happened about the emergency with the press was the worst thing that could have happened. But here was this man who actually thought that, oh, it's good if trees are being planted. Oh, it's good if buses are running on time. He had his priorities a little skewed, but he was not dishonest. I think
No.
anybody will tell you that. The
All right.
second, to answer your second question, I think he would say, "Why are you late?" Because, if you were 1 minute late, he would. I know the first time that he invited me, to have a drink, I was, still like a year into the weekly, and he was so new, and I kind of stood outside the door saying, it's really very rude to kind of just land up on time. Maybe it's polite to go 5 minutes later. The minute he answered the doorbell, he said, "Why are you late?" In that grumpy way. And I kind of sort of cringed and felt terrible. And you can imagine the impact of someone who's going to meet her editor. She's like 23 years old and just trying to impress the man, and then is told this, especially when she stood outside the door. I just want to say one point about Pavan and the postcards, because those postcards of his were so, they were just so him. And he would be, writing his answers to people who would write. And I remember him sending postcards saying, "No," that's all, the one word, "no." And I said, "Khushwant Singh, people won't know what they've asked you. They won't remember. Would you mind spelling out?" No, they should know what I'm replying to. And he has really sent out postcards with just the single word, "no."
And of course, there's the apocryphal story of the postcard that was addressed to Khushwant Singh, New Delhi, and it arrived without
yes,
the
of
address,
course.
the full address. Pavan, the same question to you.
Okay, very
Was it a
quickly.
cultivated persona?
I'll tell you, I see Khushwant loving to project a persona in which the world would be interested in, and
Hmm.
trying to lead a cloistered, more sheltered private life. You
Okay.
see, this is the only house in Delhi that I have been to when he was living there, where outside there was a board, "Please don't ring the bell if you are not expected."
Hmm.
And he did not suffer fools gladly. There
Yeah.
were a few people he liked to meet, and he liked to keep the rest of the world at bay, because I don't think he had time for trivialities or less than fulfilling conversations from his point of view. So he loved to project an image, largely created by him, if I may add, in which the world would be interested in, including the persona of the dirty old man, because he wanted to jostle conventional moral certitudes. But he wanted to live a more personal life, sheltered from people. So that angry old man was served both purposes in some way. What he would say
Of
to me
course.
if I land up in heaven, very simply, he would ask me, "What the hell is happening in the country today?"
Okay. Right. Nana, I'm just going to, and again, this is open to all three. Which of Khushwant's books would you regard as his true contribution to Indo-Anglian, I'm using that rather than Anglo-Indian, people writing in English, literature? And my reason for asking this is, and this is the point that, picking up on what Pavan had said, when I wrote an obituary for him, I mentioned that the history of the Sikhs and then the spin-off, which was the biography of Maharaja Ranjit Singh and then the fall of the Kingdom of Lahore, these were the Mount Ayr rock in his life, in his scholastic life. He never reached, and I say so in all modesty and honesty, he never reached that eminence ever again. And I couldn't understand why, because he had demonstrated that he had that capacity. And it wasn't a question of being sponsored by Princeton, etc. It was just he never again, perhaps he didn't allow himself to reach that summit of academic, intellectual, the challenge that was posed by those books. And Naina, which one out of all of the books that he's written, and you mentioned that you've not read all of them necessarily.
No, I've read all the books. I haven't read all the articles.
Which one would you regard as, which one do you think should be the symbol of his life? Any single book that comes to your mind?
Yeah. I think that he considered the 2-volume History of the Sikhs his most important contribution. As someone who's trained as a historian, I think others have written better histories of the Sikhs, and he would have acknowledged that too. Of the people he read, the people he liked very much were Hugh MacLeod and finally Harjot Oberoi. So I think he would have certainly felt that they were better historians than he was, and I would agree with him there. The book I like the most, which is patchy in quality, but I think his most ambitious is his Delia novel. That would be my favorite. And I hope that will endure. I know Train to Pakistan is the best known, but he himself considered I Shall Not Hear the Nightingale his better novel.
Indeed, indeed. But which one do you think? Which one would you regard as?
I think that, I think Train to Pakistan, because I think it kind of was just so seminal to his whole idea about what partition meant and what partition did to people, and even subsequently, what was the fallout of partition that many decades later. So I really think that I would sort of talk about this best loved book. And when you say that he never really kind of then attained or refused to attain that standard of scholarship which the History of the Sikhs was about, I think he got corrupted by journalism, because journalism is such a mistress, which kind of seduces you, gives you the quick fix. And I think a lot of things happened to Khushwant Singh. Despite him being such an iconoclast and everything, I think he really did get corrupted by the adulation he got as an editor of the Illustrated Weekly.
Yes, I see what you mean. And Pavan, for you, which is the book that symbolizes, in your mind, symbolizes?
I must say my answer is very similar to Naina's. In terms of scholarship, his volumes on Sikhs. In terms of a novel, both the Train to Pakistan and, for me especially, Delhi a novel. I've written 4 books on Delhi myself.
Yeah, I know. That's why. Yeah.
You mentioned Havelis of Old Delhi, and I devoured that book. I mean, I agree there are patchy parts in it, but I'll say that in Khushwant's books there are patchy parts in almost all his books, and some of them, like In the Company of Women, you can gloss over many pages and continue with the book. But his book on flora and fauna, impeccable. Every line of it is knowledgeable or insightful.
Yeah.
But in terms of the book, it's Delhi a novel.
Okay. Well, of course, Train to Pakistan is cathartic. It was cathartic for him. It came at a time in his life, and it came at, when he was in this emotional quandary as far as in Pakistan and India was concerned, because, as you said, his roots were there here and he was there. But nevertheless, I think it's for every person to investigate and to discover which is the book of Khushwant's prolific output that he admires and likes most. I'm reminded when you talk about the emergency and you talk about the endorsement of Sanjay Gandhi, etc. I'm reminded of the man who passed through a hedge backwards, and of course, when he emerged the other side, he was full of brambles and seared with cuts, etc. So they said, "Why did you do it?" Oh, he said, "It seemed the right thing to do at the time." Well, the same thing was true with Khushwant. He thought that that was the right thing to do at the time. Of course, he changed his mind afterwards, but in a sense, it left a kind of stain on his own conscience, not just on his reputation, but on his own conscience. Let me now conclude. You had mentioned, BACHI, about the epitaph that he had drafted for himself. I'm not sure, it's without sounding blasphemous, he intended it as quasi-blasphemous, when he wrote, "Here lies one who spared neither man nor God. Waste not your tears on him. He was a whatever." Okay? And it rhymes with God. Now, let me now pose a final question to each of you. And NAINA, he, as you mentioned, Manzoor Kadir, and the epitaph that he wrote is that he said, "It can only be written in tears which leave no stain on paper." So, what would be, in a few words, what would be the epitaph that you would like to record for him? It doesn't matter.
None. I think I'd let his work speak for him. I think what you drafted was really beautiful, actually, and what he would have wanted.
Okay, that's lovely. And BACHI, from your side?
Well, we're really tough, but I mean, I would just say that, here was a man who really told it like it was.
Okay. And PAVAN?
I think that to sum up a man like Khushwant is difficult, but I would say I would have liked to hear as a man who, or a genius who loved to be misunderstood.
Okay. All right. Vikram, when he spoke, Khushwant's epitaph, in my opinion, should be his inimitable words, scattered, as Vikram had said earlier at the beginning, for decades more. Because really, there can be no greater tribute to any writer than that he should continue to be relevant. It's a dream of every author. And I remember when I'd given up writing, I got rather fed up of it. And AIJAZUDDIN Batalvi, who was one of the famous lawyers, rather like Manzoor, in fact, I think he seconded with Manzoor Kadir Sahab. AIJAZUDDIN Batalvi said, "Fakir Sahab, आपने लिखना बंद कर दिया." तो मैंने कहा, "Batalvi Sahab कोई पढ़ता नहीं है." So he said, "हाँ, सही कह रहे हैं आप. Shakespeare को भी यही गिला था." Shakespeare he also complained of this. And then he added, "Fakir Sahab, आपका काम है लिखना. पढ़न वाले पैदा हो जाएंगे, वो पैदा हो जाएंगे." And that, in a sense, must be the expectation of every writer, every author, and what we hope will be the testament for Khushwant. Let me just conclude with one aphorism that I'd heard. A man, any person, they do not die when they're dead. They don't die when they're dead. They die when they're forgotten. And as long as the Litfest reminds us that there was this wonderful, wonderful friend, writer, companion, drinking companion, if you like, father, and a grandfather, as long as we remember that, then the name of Khushwant Singh will remain Amar Rahega. And for that, we're deeply, deeply grateful. Now, I think there may be one or two questions. Somebody, we got 7 minutes to the end. Somebody's asked a question here. It's, if Khushwant Singh was the PM of India, what is the one major decision he would have made? What do you think? The first is, I don't think he would have accepted. But NAINA, do you think he would have made any kind of critical decision which would have affected the future of your country?
He would have spoken to everybody who's protesting against him.
Okay. And BACHI?
So what was your question? What was it that, what would
Yeah,
be the
if
decision he would
Khushwant
make
Singh had
today?
been, if he had been PM of India, what is the one major decision he would have made?
If I
It's a
can
question
say
from the
so, I
audience.
think he would make every decision that is not being made today. And I'll leave it at that.
Oh, okay. He wouldn't undo them, he'd just not make them. All right. And PAVAN?
I think he would have removed prohibition from both Gujarat and Bihar.
Well, that's taking a rather narrow view, but I mean, there must be other crises and challenges in India, yes, other than prohibition. I mean, we're going through it. And but what would you regard as the critical decision that he would make? Any? None?
Is the question to me?
Yeah, of course. Yes. You have to
Sorry.
complete yours
No,
because
I think that
you've had your peg.
one decision he would take, and I don't know how he would take it, in what form, what he would do, would be to put an end to social disequilibrium,
Okay.
hate, bigotry, and division.
Okay, I'm now going to ask you one final question, and the answer is yes or no. NAINA, was Khushwant a pseudo-agnostic or an insufficient Sikh?
Can't
be yes or no. It has to be a choice.
Yes or no.
Okay, but it'll have to be brief because we've only got 3 minutes left. So was he a pseudo-agnostic or an insufficient Sikh?
Well, agnostic is quite a capacious word. It can include an interest, a deep interest in religion.
Okay.
The two are not mutually exclusive. So he was deeply interested in religion, but he wasn't sure of the existence of God.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. Although one must admit that he was such a humanist that there is no way that he could have allowed himself in the hereafter not to expect to believe, to encounter God. There was so much humanity in him that it's rather like Voltaire saying that, when I look at a watch, I believe there must have been a watchmaker. There must have been, for him, there must have been a God. For you, was he a pseudo-agnostic or an insufficient Sikh?
I think that he was, I think NAINA is right when he says, agnostic, in the sense that he didn't believe in the rituals, he didn't believe in the mumbo jumbo, but he certainly was a great believer in human beings, and I think certainly of a higher power, because the number of times and the amount of time he has spent, on the hymns of Nanak and on the hymns of religious people. So he definitely did believe. He didn't believe in ritual, but he certainly did believe. And I don't think is your question an insufficient Sikh?
Yes.
Well, I mean, maybe I'm not competent enough to answer that question, but I think he was one of the biggest believers of the Sikhs and of Sikhism and even the symbols of Sikhism. I mean, if anything put him off from Mrs. Gandhi, it was Operation Blue Star, and that's when his
award.
Yeah, absolutely. And and he got very angry when Rahul cut off his hair. I mean, he didn't speak to him for, I don't know, forever. So he was certainly not an efficient Sikh, whatever else he was.
Okay, the reason I mentioned this is, and why I posed the question, that at the beginning, when he wrote the history of the Sikhs, it was a discovery. It was not a renaissance, it was a naissance for him. And then he wrote the sacred writings of the Sikhs, all part of the same, the same group. And it was only later in his life, NAINA, you remember, when he then wrote the Japji, the translation of the Japji, etc., and also the translation of the Shikwa and Jawab-e-Shikwa. And anybody who reads that recognizes that he was a modern Milton, writing Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. I mean, it was the same kind of principle. That's why I asked you, because I think towards the end of his life, he then wished to be closer to religion and to God than he had been. And PAVAN, for you, was he a pseudo-agnostic or an insufficient Sikh?
Yeah, I think he was He liked to believe he was agnostic, but he
Yeah.
was deeply spiritual.
Okay. Very much indeed, Naina, BACHI, and Pavan, for a very stimulating recollection of reminiscences and opinions, and also a reconstruction of the life who obviously um, had facets which are more than the sum of all of us. But thank you so much indeed for making this a special occasion, and particularly Naina, because I've never heard you speak about your grandfather quite in this way, and I'm deeply touched that you've shared that confidence with us. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank
The
you.
next session will be on Planet Palm, a global threat, and it's Bitu Sehgal in conversation with Jocelyn Zuckerman. They're both passionate environmentalists, and will discuss Jocelyn's book, Planet Palm, which one reviewer has described as a definitive, damning account of the history of palm oil production and the ecological destruction it causes. So please join us and for the next session. Thank you, and thank you all the participants.